Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I stood behind the counter of the small diner, balancing a tray of dirty dishes on one arm while reaching for the coffee pot with the other. My feet aching from a 12-hour shift, my back stiff from hours of bending, my eyes burning from exhaustion that had become my constant companion. The scent of burnt coffee and greasy burgers clung to my uniform. The distant hum of conversation blending with the clatter of silverware, the kind of background noise that had become the soundtrack of my life. I glanced at the clock, barely past 9, still 2 hours to go before I could go home, still 2 hours before I could collapse in a bed and get just enough rest to do it all over again tomorrow. This was my life now. Single mother, minimum wage worker, the cautionary tale whispered behind polite smiles, the failure my family barely bothered to hide their disappointment in, the one who had thrown her life away the second I decided to keep my son. I could still hear my mother's voice in my head, that same exhausted sigh she always used when she talked about me, the one that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken resentments. You had so much potential, Sarah. You could have gone to college, you could have had a real career, but instead, you chose to struggle. You did this to yourself. And, of course, the inevitable comparison, the one that had been drilled into me for as long as I could remember, the golden standard I had never quite measured up to. You should have been more like Jake. Because Jake, my younger brother, my parents' pride and joy, the golden child who could do no wrong, had done everything right. He had gotten the degree, landed the high-paying job, charmed his way into the perfect relationship with a wealthy woman who could fund his perfect lifestyle. He had given my parents everything they wanted, a son they could brag about, a future they could be proud of, a life that made them feel like they had done something right. Meanwhile, I had given them a grandson whose father wanted nothing to do with him, a child born into struggle, a burden they hadn't asked for. I was nothing more than a living, breathing disappointment. I showed up to my parents' house on Sunday evening, exhausted from my shift, already regretting agreeing to this ridiculous family dinner, already knowing exactly how the night was going to go. My mother greeted me with a tight smile, her eyes flicking over my cheap department store dress with barely concealed disapproval, her lips pursed like she was holding back some criticism she didn't have the energy to voice. My father, as always, barely acknowledged me, too focused on whatever game was playing on the TV, too disinterested to even pretend he was happy to see me. But Jake? Jake was beaming. He strolled in 10 minutes after me, wearing his designer clothes, his polished watch gleaming under the warm kitchen lights, the same effortless confidence radiating off of him that had always made him seem untouchable. He barely spared me a glance as he hugged our mother, kissed her cheek, slipped effortlessly into the role of the perfect son. And, as expected, the night quickly became about him. About his new promotion, about the expensive trip he and his fiancée were planning, about the luxury apartment they had just moved into, about the kind of life I was never going to have, about how proud my parents were of him. Meanwhile, I was barely acknowledged, an afterthought at my own family's dinner table. I chewed my food in silence, my stomach twisting with something ugly, something that had been festering for years, something that had started as disappointment, but had long since morphed into something far colder. And then, just as I was about to excuse myself, just as I was about to escape before they could make me feel any smaller than I already did, Jake turned to me with that smirk, that familiar glint of amusement in his eyes, that same condescending tone I had grown up with. "So, Sarah," he said, resting his elbows on the table, his voice dripping with mockery, with the effortless cruelty of someone who had never known what it felt like to struggle. "How's life treating you? Still flipping burgers? Still living paycheck to paycheck?" A sharp silence fell over the table. My mother shifting uncomfortably, my father suddenly very interested in his drink, but none of them said a word, because they weren't going to defend me. Because this was entertainment to them. I felt my fingers curl in a fist beneath the table, felt my chest tighten with the kind of humiliation that burned deep. But I didn't let it show. I didn't give them the satisfaction. I just smiled, slow and careful, meeting my brother's gaze without flinching, without letting him see just how deeply his words had cut. "It's not easy," I said lightly, keeping my tone even, keeping the edge of fury buried beneath the surface. "But at least I work for what I have." His smirk faltered, just for a second, but then he let out a short, amused laugh, shaking his head, still looking at me like I was nothing more than a bad decision waiting to be fixed. "That's cute," he said, taking a sip of his wine. "But come on, Sarah. You know you're never going to get ahead like this. You should have done what I did. You should have made better choices." Something inside me snapped. I exhaled slowly, pushing my chair back, standing up without another word, without another glance, without giving them the argument they clearly wanted. Because I wasn't going to waste my energy defending myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth defending. I grabbed my coat, forcing my expression into something neutral, ignoring the way my mother was watching me with thinly veiled disappointment, ignoring the way my father still hadn't looked at me once, ignoring the way Jake was still grinning, like he had already won. And maybe in that moment he had, because I was still struggling, because I was still the joke at their table, because I was still the one they pitted. But as I walked out of that house, as I stepped into the cold night air, as I let the door shut behind me, I made a silent promise. One day, they would regret underestimating me. One day, they would wish they had treated me differently. And one day, Jake would learn that being the golden child didn't mean he was untouchable. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, my mother's message burning into the screen, the words feeling strangely unfamiliar, almost like they had been sent to the wrong person. Call me. It's about Jake. Just 6 little words, but I could already feel the weight of them pressing down on me, settling deep in my chest, stirring something sharp and uneasy in the back of my mind. She had never once reached out to me first, had never made an effort to check in unless it was out of obligation, had never cared enough to ask how I was doing. And now, after all this time, she wanted to talk about Jake? For a moment, I considered ignoring it, considered tossing my phone onto the coffee table and going to bed, considered pretending like I hadn't seen it, because I already knew. Whatever had happened, whatever was wrong, whatever had finally made the golden child fall from grace, it wasn't my problem. But the curiosity gnawed at me, sank its claws into my thoughts, refused to let me rest, because as much as I wanted to pretend like I didn't care, I did. Maybe not about Jake, maybe not about my mother, but about the truth, about knowing what had happened, about understanding why, after years of treating me like an afterthought, she suddenly needed to talk. With a slow, measured breath, I picked up my phone, my fingers tightening around it, my pulse steady but a little too fast, my stomach twisting just slightly as I finally typed out my response. What about him? I stared at the screen, waiting, watching the 3 little dots appear and disappear, a sign that she was typing, then hesitating, then typing again, like she wasn't sure how much she wanted to tell me, like she was carefully choosing her words, like she knew that whatever she said next would determine whether or not I even cared enough to keep this conversation going. And then, finally, the message came through. He lost everything. I blinked, my grip on the phone tightening just slightly, my breath catching for half a second, because those weren't the words I had been expecting. I had spent years listening to my parents gush about Jake's success, had spent too many family dinners being forced to listen to the endless praise, the endless admiration, the endless reminders that he was everything I wasn't. And now, suddenly, he had lost everything? I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, sharp and scathing, the way she had scoffed at my struggles, the way she had dismissed my pain, the way she had made it so very clear that I was the failure, the disappointment, the child who had made all the wrong choices. But now, suddenly, the golden boy, the son who could do no wrong, the man they had spent their whole lives idolizing, had fallen? I should have felt nothing. I should have shrugged, tossed my phone aside, moved on with my night, gone to bed without a second thought, because it wasn't my problem. But I couldn't ignore it, because for the first time in my life, the roles had reversed. It took 2 more messages before my mother finally admitted the truth. Jake's business had failed. Not just a little, not just a bad quarter, not just a minor setback. A complete and utter collapse. He had spent years living beyond his means, had taken out loans he couldn't pay back, had invested in the wrong people, had ignored every warning sign, had burned through every dollar like he was untouchable. And now, after years of being the golden child, after years of being the son they had worshipped, after years of being their pride and joy, he was broke. I leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly, processing it, letting the words settle into my bones, letting the reality of it sink in, letting myself feel the weight of what this meant. Jake, the man who had once laughed in my face for struggling, who had once smirked across a dinner table and mocked me for working paycheck to paycheck, who had never once acknowledged how hard my life had been, had finally learned what it meant to lose. And my mother? The same woman who had dismissed me, ignored me, belittled me, the same woman who had spent years treating me like I was an embarrassment. Now she needed my help. Because Jake had burned through everything. Because Jake had taken them down with him. Because now they had nothing. And suddenly, I wasn't the failure anymore. I didn't respond right away. I let my mother wait, let her sit with the silence, let her wonder whether or not I was even going to answer, Let her feel, for the first time, what it was like to reach out and not know if the other person would care enough to reply. I let her feel exactly what I had felt for years. But deep down, I already knew I was going to go see her. Not because I wanted to help, not because I felt any sympathy, but because I needed to see it for myself. I needed to see what it looked like when the golden child fell. I needed to see how it felt to finally be the one who had something they didn't. So the next morning, I got in my car, drove across town, parked in front of my parents' house. The same house where I had once sat at a dinner table and been laughed at by the very people who were now drowning. I took a deep breath, stepped out, walked up the familiar driveway, knocked on the door, waited. And when my mother opened it, her face pale, her eyes tired, her mouth pressed into a thin, uneasy line, the weight of her desperation visible in every part of her expression, I smiled. Because, for the first time in my life, I had all the power. My mother stood in the doorway, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes scanning my face like she was looking for something. Pity, maybe, or sympathy, or some sign that I still cared enough to be the daughter she had ignored for years. But I just stood there, silent, calm, watching her like I was an outsider, like I was no longer part of this family, like I was nothing more than a spectator to the mess they had created for themselves. She exhaled, her fingers tightening around the edge of the door, her breath uneven, like she didn't want to say the words but had no choice. "Come in, Sarah," she said finally, stepping aside, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it before. "We need to talk." I walked inside without a word, my footsteps slow, deliberate, my eyes scanning the house, noting the changes, the little details that told me more than she ever could. The expensive furniture was still there, the polished floors still shining, the perfectly arranged family photos still hanging on the walls, but there was something different now, something off. The air felt heavy, the silence too thick, the house no longer a symbol of wealth and success, but a carefully maintained illusion of control. And in that moment, I knew they were hiding the truth. Jake wasn't there. I knew it before my mother even said it, before she sat me down in the living room, before she poured herself a glass of wine with shaking hands, before she started speaking in that carefully controlled tone she always used when she was trying to make things sound better than they were. "He's going through a rough patch," she said, staring at the wine in her glass, swirling it slowly, avoiding my gaze like she thought I wouldn't notice. "Business can be unpredictable, and sometimes things don't go as planned. But he's handling it. He just needed some time away to figure things out." I almost laughed because I had heard those exact words before, not about Jake, but about myself, back when I had been the one struggling, back when I had been the one trying to survive, back when my mother had looked at me with that same thinly veiled disappointment and told me I had made my bed and now had to lie in it. But Jake? Jake wasn't allowed to fail. Jake wasn't allowed to be anything less than perfect. So now, instead of admitting the truth, instead of facing the reality that their golden child had burned through everything and walked away without looking back, my parents were trying to rewrite the story, trying to soften the edges, trying to turn a complete disaster into nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, tilting my head slightly, watching her like a stranger, watching her like I was seeing her for the first time. "So where is he?" I asked, keeping my voice even, keeping my expression neutral, keeping the satisfaction buried deep enough that she wouldn't see it. My mother hesitated, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, her lips parting, closing, parting again, like she was trying to find the right words, like she was trying to come up with a version of the truth that didn't sound quite so humiliating. "He's taking some time to clear his head," she said finally, and the way she said it, the way her voice wavered just slightly, told me everything I needed to know. He had run. Just like that. Just like my ex had run the second things got hard. Just like I had been left behind to pick up the pieces. Just like I had been forced to scrape together a life from the ashes of someone else's mistakes. And now, my parents, asterisk asterisk, the same people who had mocked me for struggling, who had dismissed me when I had nowhere to turn, who had looked down on me for years, asterisk asterisk, had been abandoned by the very son they had worshipped. The irony was almost poetic. For the next hour, I listened to my mother talk, listened to her carefully crafted half-truths, listened to her talk about Jake like he was just going through a phase, like he would be back soon, like everything would be fine as long as they just gave him time. But underneath it all, I could hear the panic. I could hear the fear in her voice, the desperation in her carefully chosen words, the unspoken truth that sat between us like a weight she didn't want to name. Because Jake wasn't coming back. Not now. Not soon. Maybe not ever. And that meant they were on their own. That meant for the first time in their lives, they didn't have their golden child to save them. And that meant they needed me. It didn't take long for the conversation to shift, for my mother to finally say the words I had known were coming, for her to put down her glass, fold her hands in her lap, and look at me with a forced softness that I had never seen before. "Sarah," she said, her voice low, careful, testing, like she was waiting to see if I would take the bait. "You've done so well for yourself." I nearly laughed. For years, they had ignored my achievements, dismissed my success, pretended like my hard work didn't matter because it wasn't as shiny or impressive as Jake's. But now, suddenly, they wanted to acknowledge it. Now, suddenly, they needed it. She exhaled, offering me a small, tight smile, the kind of smile that was meant to be warm but didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye," she continued, her tone softer now, more delicate, like she thought that a few carefully placed words could erase years of neglect. "But family helps family. And right now, your father and I could use a little support." There was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I had imagined for years, the moment I had once thought would bring me some kind of twisted satisfaction, the moment when my mother, the woman who had looked down on me for my entire life, was now sitting across from me, asking for my help. I inhaled slowly, pressing my tongue against the inside of my cheek, keeping my expression unreadable, keeping my voice neutral, keeping the sharp, cutting amusement buried deep beneath the surface. "You mean money," I said simply, watching as my mother stiffened just slightly, watching as the illusion cracked just enough to see the truth underneath. Her smile faltered, her shoulders tensing, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. "Just for a little while," she said, her voice still light, still careful, still acting like this wasn't a big deal, like it was just a minor inconvenience, like I should say yes without hesitation, without resentment, without remembering every cruel word she had ever said to me. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, tilting my head, watching her, studying her, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to squirm. "You mean after everything," I said, my voice slow, deliberate, sharp, "after the way you treated me, after the way you ignored me, after everything you said. Now you need me?" She swallowed, her breath hitching just slightly, but she didn't answer. Because she didn't have to. Because we both already knew. And for the first time in my life, I had the power to say no. My mother sat across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her lips curved into the same tight smile she always used when she was trying to manipulate a conversation in her favor. Her carefully controlled expression a poor attempt at masking the sheer desperation lingering beneath the surface. My father, who had barely acknowledged my existence for most of my adult life, sat beside her, staring at the floor, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his knee, his silence heavy, uncomfortable, as if the weight of asking me for help was already too much for his pride to bear. And yet here they were, the same parents who had mocked me, dismissed me, belittled me, ignored me when I had needed them most. Now, they were acting like I was their only hope. I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms, watching them carefully, watching the way my mother tried so hard to appear composed, watching the way my father refused to meet my eyes, watching the way they sat on that couch, like they weren't the same people who had spent years making it clear that my struggles were nothing more than my own fault. "Jake will come back," my mother said suddenly, breaking the silence, her voice light, rehearsed, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. He needs time to figure things out. He's always been so independent, you know? He doesn't like asking for help." I almost laughed, the irony of the statement settling deep into my bones, my fingers tightening around my arms, my lips twitching with amusement I didn't bother hiding. "He doesn't like asking for help?" I repeated, tilting my head slightly, arching a brow, my voice dripping with something dangerously close to mockery. "And yet, here you are, asking me for help." The room went silent again, thick with the unspoken truth that neither of them wanted to acknowledge, the truth that sat between us like a slow-burning fire waiting to consume everything in its path. They had spent years looking down on me, treating me like I was nothing more than a disappointment, watching me struggle without an ounce of sympathy, making sure I knew, at every opportunity, that I had made my bed and would have to lie in it. But now suddenly, they wanted to pretend like they had always believed in me. My mother sighed, shaking her head, reaching for a glass of wine, taking a slow sip before placing it back down on the table with deliberate care, as if she was trying to compose herself before speaking again. "You know," she started, her voice soft, careful, too measured, too perfectly crafted to be real. "We've always been proud of you, Sarah. We might not have said it enough, But we always knew you'd make something of yourself. You've always been so strong, so resilient. I stiffened, my stomach twisting, something sharp and bitter clawing its way up my throat, something dangerously close to outrage. Because how dare she? How dare she sit here and rewrite history? How dare she pretend like the years of neglect, the years of judgment, the years of making me feel like I was nothing more than a failure had never happened? I clenched my jaw, inhaling slowly through my nose, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to remain composed, forcing myself not to let them see just how much their words made my blood boil. "That's funny," I said, my voice light, casual, mocking, watching as my mother's fingers twitched slightly at my tone. "Because I don't remember you being proud of me when I was working double shifts just to keep food on the table. I don't remember you being proud of me when I was too exhausted to function, too drained to even think straight. I don't remember you being proud of me when I was struggling to afford rent while raising a child on my own." My mother's face paled, her carefully crafted composure cracking just slightly, just enough for me to see the truth hiding beneath the surface. She didn't like that I was calling her out, didn't like that I was reminding her of the version of me she had never cared about. "But that was different," she said quickly, her voice sharp, defensive, as if my suffering had been something completely separate from what they were dealing with now. "You made your choices, Sarah. You decided to be a single mother. That was never supposed to happen." "Jake," she paused, glancing at my father, who still refused to look at me, before continuing, her voice softer now, pleading. "Jake didn't choose this. He had a future. He had everything lined up. He didn't deserve this." I felt something snap inside me, something cold, something cruel, something that had been sitting in my chest for years, waiting for the moment to finally break free. "And I did?" I asked, my voice sharp, cutting, dripping with the kind of rage I had spent a lifetime swallowing down. I deserved it. I deserved to suffer, to struggle, to be abandoned. But because Jake was supposed to have a perfect life, suddenly I should feel sorry for him. My mother's mouth opened, then closed, her face twisting with frustration, with disbelief, with something dangerously close to guilt, because she knew I was right. She knew I had every reason to throw their hypocrisy back in their faces. She knew that she had spent years pretending my struggles weren't real, pretending like I had done this to myself while Jake had been given every opportunity to succeed. And now, Jake was gone. Gone without a word. Gone without looking back. Gone without caring that the very parents who had spent their entire lives putting him on a pedestal were now left drowning in the mess he had left behind. I sat back, exhaling slowly, watching my mother carefully, watching as she struggled to come up with another excuse, another justification, another way to twist this conversation into something she could control. And then, finally, I let myself smile. It was slow, careful, calculated, the kind of smile that held 1,000 unspoken things, the kind of smile that made my mother tense just slightly, the kind of smile that let her know I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "You need help," I said, my voice steady, controlled, dangerously unreadable. "And you think I'm the one who's going to give it to you?" My mother inhaled sharply, my father shifting uncomfortably in his seat, neither of them denying it, neither of them arguing, neither of them having the nerve to say out loud what we all already knew. They had no other options. I was their only hope, and that was exactly what I wanted them to believe. So I tilted my head, offering them a slow, thoughtful nod, letting the silence stretch just long enough for them to start believing, just long enough for them to start hoping, just long enough for them to think that maybe, just maybe, they could manipulate me one last time. "I'll think about it," I said finally, standing up, brushing invisible dust off my shirt, straightening my posture, watching as their eyes lit up just slightly, just enough for me to know they had fallen for it. Because the truth was, I'd already made my decision, and they were never going to see it coming. I let them believe it for days, let them sit with the hope, let them think that maybe, just maybe, I would swoop in and save them the way they had expected Jake to. I answered their calls but never gave them a straight answer, responded to their messages but never made a commitment, let them ramble on about how hard things had become without ever offering a solution. And every time my mother's voice wavered, just slightly, every time my father sighed like the weight of the world was pressing down on him, every time I caught the sheer desperation seeping through their carefully crafted words, I felt something sharp, an electric coil in my chest. They were finally feeling what I had felt for years. I dragged it out, let them sweat, let them taste the bitterness of uncertainty, let them sit in the same helplessness they had so easily ignored when it had been me on the other end. It was almost too easy to watch them stumble over their own pride, to hear the way my mother's voice softened whenever she spoke to me now, to witness my father, A man who had spent my entire life acting as if I barely existed, now trying to reach out like we had always been close. But nothing was more satisfying than the moment my mother finally cracked, her voice trembling over the phone, her forced calm finally slipping away, her words laced with something that almost sounded like defeat. "Sarah," she had said, her voice no longer carrying that condescending edge it always had, no longer dripping with disapproval, no longer holding the same icy superiority. "Please, just tell us if you're going to help or not." I had smiled then, slow and careful, tapping my fingers against the kitchen counter, letting her sit in the silence, letting her realize that she no longer had the power here. "Mom," I had said, my voice light, sweet, deliberately slow, the way she had once spoken to me when I had begged for her approval, when I had wanted nothing more than for her to see me. "I told you I'm thinking about it." She had exhaled sharply, the frustration finally breaking through, but she didn't snap, didn't push, didn't dare to say something cruel, because she knew, deep down, that I was the one holding all the cards now. And God, for the first time in my life, I wanted to see just how far I could push them. The knock on my door came late one evening, sharp and unexpected, the sound sending a slow ripple of unease down my spine, because I already knew this wasn't my parents. My mother wouldn't dare show up unannounced, not when she was still trying so hard to pretend that she hadn't spent years looking down on me, not when she was still clinging to the last scraps of her pride. No, there was only one person reckless enough, shameless enough, entitled enough to show up at my door without warning, without invitation, without a single ounce of shame. I opened the door, my fingers tightening around the handle, my stomach twisting, my pulse spiking just slightly, and there he was, Jake. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the space between us thick with something sharp, something heavy, something tainted with too many years of resentment. He looked different, not broken, not struggling, not like a man who had truly lost everything, but different. His clothes weren't as expensive, his hair wasn't as neatly styled, his face wasn't as smooth, and there was something in his eyes, something restless, something hollow, something I had never seen before. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly, offering me that same smirk, that same arrogant half-smile, that same effortless confidence that had always made me want to scream. "Sarah," he said, his voice smooth, easy, like we were old friends catching up, like he hadn't spent years treating me like an embarrassment. "Long time no see." I tilted my head, crossing my arms over my chest, raising a brow, letting him know that I wasn't impressed, that I wasn't falling for whatever game he thought he was playing. "Jake," I said simply, keeping my voice even, unreadable. "What do you want?" He chuckled, shaking his head, slipping his hands into his pockets, rocking back on his heels like he was standing in front of some stranger instead of the sister he had spent his whole life mocking. "You're not even going to invite me in?" he asked, arching a brow, as if I owed him anything, as if I was still supposed to play the role of the naive older sister who would always be there for him. I stared at him for a long moment, taking in the way his smirk faltered just slightly, the way his fingers twitched inside his pockets, the way his jaw tightened as the silence stretched too long, as he realized I wasn't the same person he had once dismissed so easily. And then I laughed low and quiet, shaking my head, stepping back just enough to make it clear that he wasn't welcome here, that this wasn't going to be the conversation he thought it would be. "Cut the act, Jake," I said, my voice sharper now, no longer playing along, no longer willing to let him pretend like we had ever been close. "What do you want?" He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back, the smirk disappearing, his expression shifting into something harder, something more calculated, something that felt far more like the real him. "I need money," he said finally, blunt, unbothered, as if he wasn't standing in front of the sister he had spent his entire life looking down on, as if he wasn't asking for help from the very person he had laughed at when she was struggling. I inhaled slowly, letting the words settle, letting the sheer audacity of them sink in, letting myself feel the full weight of what was happening, of what he was asking me to do, of what this moment truly meant. Jake had never needed me before. Jake had never wanted anything from me before. And now, when he had burned through everything, when his entire life had crumbled around him, when the parents who had worshipped him were left drowning in the mess he had made, now suddenly I mattered. I exhaled, stepping forward, staring up at him, watching as his expression shifted just slightly, as something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, hesitation, maybe even fear. And then I smiled, slow and deliberate, tilting my head slightly, letting him believe, just for a moment, that he still had power over me. Let me think about it, I said, the same words I had given my mother, the same careful promise that held nothing but empty hope, the same game I had been playing since the second they had come crawling back. Because the truth was, I already knew my answer. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I had won. Because as I stood there, staring at the brother who had never once cared about me, who had only come back when he had no one left, who was only standing here now because he needed something from me, I realized that revenge wasn't going to fix anything. Because no matter how much power I had now, it would never change the past. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of my son's breathing from the next room, feeling the weight of something heavy settle deep in my chest, something cold and unfamiliar that I couldn't quite shake. I had spent years dreaming of this moment, of the day when my family would finally understand what it felt like to be powerless, when they would finally know what it was like to struggle, when they would finally come to me, desperate and broken, begging for help the way I had once begged them. And now that it had finally happened, now that I had all the power, now that they were the ones drowning, I wasn't sure if I wanted to watch them sink. I had thought revenge would feel satisfying, had thought that turning my back on them would feel like justice, had thought that hearing my mother's voice shake over the phone would finally be enough to make up for all the years of being ignored, all the years of being treated like an afterthought, all the years of being reminded that I would never measure up to Jake. But as I lay there in the quiet darkness, my hands clenched in a fist against the blanket, my throat tight with something I didn't want to name, I realized the truth that had been lingering at the edges of my thoughts all along. Revenge wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't erase the years of loneliness, wouldn't undo the pain of being dismissed, wouldn't fix the wounds that had already scarred over, wouldn't give me back the time I had spent trying to prove my worth to people who had never cared enough to see it. My parents would never truly understand what I had gone through, would never acknowledge the depth of the damage they had done, would never be able to go back and undo the choices they had made. And Jake would never be sorry. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. Because the truth was, he wasn't here because he regretted the way he had treated me. He wasn't here because he had suddenly realized that I was worth something. He wasn't here because he cared about making things right. He was here because he had no other options. And I was the last one standing. The next morning, my mother called again. I let it ring. Then she called again. And again. And again. Until, finally, I answered, pressing the phone to my ear, already bracing myself for whatever carefully rehearsed plea she had prepared, already expecting the same empty words, the same half-hearted justifications, the same desperate attempts to rewrite history. "Sarah," she said, her voice softer than usual, carrying that same thin layer of practiced warmth she had always used whenever she was trying to manipulate a conversation in her favor. "I know you're upset. I know we didn't always make the right choices, but you have to understand, we were doing what we thought was best. We never meant to hurt you." I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly, my grip on the phone tightening, my chest aching with something that felt dangerously close to exhaustion, because how many times had I told myself that if they ever apologized, I would be able to forgive them? How many times had I imagined this exact conversation, had convinced myself that if they just admitted they had been wrong, I would finally be able to let go of the anger, finally be able to stop carrying the weight of their rejection. But now that it was happening, now that the words were finally being spoken, I didn't feel relief. I felt nothing at all. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, my voice flat, empty, devoid of anything resembling emotion. "You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry that Jake left and that you have no one else to turn to. You're sorry that you're in a mess you can't fix. You're sorry that your perfect son turned out to be a fraud. But you're not sorry for how you treated me. And you never will be." She exhaled sharply, like she had expected me to cave, like she had truly believed that a few carefully chosen words would be enough to undo everything. Like she had thought that the same daughter she had ignored for years would be willing to forgive and forget now that she was useful. "Sarah," she tried again, her voice tighter now, more desperate, more real. "We're family. Families help each other. I know we made mistakes. I know we could have been better, but please don't let this ruin us. Don't let your pride get in the way of doing the right thing." I almost laughed, almost let the sheer audacity of it spill out in the form of bitter amusement. Because wasn't that just like her? Wasn't that just like them? To twist it around, to make it my fault, to make me feel like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was the one choosing to hurt them instead of simply moving on. She had spent years looking down on me, had spent years making me feel small, had spent years dismissing my pain as if it was nothing more than an inconvenience to her. And now, when the tables had turned, when she was the one reaching out, when she was the one at the mercy of someone else's decision. She wanted me to be the bigger person. I could feel the silence stretching, feel her waiting for me to give in, feel her holding her breath, waiting for me to tell her what she wanted to hear. And then, before I could answer, before I could make a choice, before I could decide whether I wanted to walk away or offer mercy, Jake called. I let the call go to voicemail, let it sit there for a long moment, let the weight of it press against me like a slow-building storm, because I already knew, whatever he had to say, it wasn't going to be an apology. I waited until my mother finally gave up, waited until the phone stopped ringing, waited until the house was completely silent before I finally pressed play, bringing the phone to my ear, letting my brother's voice fill the room, low and smooth and utterly unapologetic. "Sarah," he started, sighing heavily, like this entire situation was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. Like he was already irritated that he had to be having this conversation at all. "Look, I get it. You're mad. You think this is karma or whatever, and you probably think you're teaching us a big lesson right now. But come on, what's the point? You're just being petty. We both know you have the money to help, and we both know you're not actually going to let mom and dad suffer." I felt my stomach twist, my hands curling in a fist at my sides, my breath coming slow and steady as I let his words sink in, as I let myself absorb the sheer entitlement dripping from his voice, as I realized that even after everything, even after losing everything, he still thought he was above me. He still thought he could push me. He still thought he could manipulate me. He still thought I was the same girl who would do anything just to earn a sliver of his approval. But I wasn't. Not anymore. I inhaled slowly, exhaling just as carefully, letting the anger settle, letting the decision solidify in my mind, letting myself feel the absolute certainty of what I was about to do. Then, without another thought, I deleted the voicemail, placed my phone face down on the table, and finally made my choice. The truth didn't come in a dramatic confrontation, didn't unfold in some grand explosion of secrets, didn't arrive with accusations thrown across the room like weapons meant to wound. Instead, it came quietly, slipped into my hands like a carefully placed knife, waiting for me to decide what I wanted to do with it. I hadn't gone looking for it, hadn't expected it, hadn't even thought about the possibility that my brother could be worse than I had already believed, but fate had a cruel sense of humor, and it wanted me to know exactly who Jake really was. It started with a simple transaction, a routine check on my own finances, something I had done 1,000 times before without issue. But as I scrolled through my banking app, my attention was caught by something small, something insignificant at first glance, something that might not have meant anything to someone else. A name, a familiar name, a business name I recognized from years ago, a luxury investment firm in Miami, one I knew Jake had connections with, one I knew he had done business with in the past, one I had assumed had long since cut ties with him after his so-called financial ruin. Except, according to the records in front of me, they hadn't. Because someone Jake, without a doubt, had been quietly moving money through that firm for months. Money he wasn't supposed to have. Money he had let our parents believe was gone. Money he had hoarded while they begged me for help. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my breath shallow, my hands tightening around my phone, my mind struggling to process what this meant. I had spent weeks listening to my mother cry over the phone, had spent weeks watching my father sit in silence, had spent weeks pretending to consider helping them while they clung to the idea that Jake had simply fallen on hard times. They had defended him, made excuses for him, rewritten history to paint him as the victim. And the whole time, while they were struggling, while they were drowning, while they were waiting for their golden son to come home and fix everything, he had been watching from a distance, letting them suffer, letting them believe he was just as lost as they were. He hadn't just abandoned them. He had played them. I didn't tell them right away, didn't rush over in a fury, didn't call them screaming about how stupid they had been, didn't let them see how deeply this betrayal burned in my chest. Instead, I let it settle, let the weight of it sink into my bones, let myself sit with the reality of what this meant. That no matter how much my parents believed Jake could do no wrong, they would have to face the truth now. Because this wasn't something they could ignore. This wasn't something they could twist into a misunderstanding. This wasn't something they could blame on me. So I waited. And when I finally went to see them, when I walked into that house one last time, when I sat across from them and watched them try to read my expression, try to figure out if I had come with an offer of mercy or a final refusal, I let them speak first. "Have you thought about it?" my mother asked, her voice careful, hesitant, almost hopeful, as if she truly believed I had softened, as if she truly thought I might still be the daughter she could manipulate. I let the silence stretch, let her sit in it, Let the anticipation build. Let the air grow thick with expectation before I finally exhaled, tilting my head slightly, my expression unreadable. I said, watching the way my father tensed, the way my mother leaned forward just slightly, as if bracing for the answer she wanted to hear. And then, with the kind of cold satisfaction I had never thought I would be capable of, I dropped the bomb. Jake isn't broke, I said, watching as confusion flickered across their faces, watching as my mother frowned, watching as my father shook his head slightly, watching as they tried to understand what I was saying. He never was. He's been hiding money for months. He's been sitting on a small fortune while you've been sitting here, waiting for him to save you. My mother's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sweater, her lips parting like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to tell me I was wrong, like she wanted to insist that Jake would never do something like that. But she didn't, because she couldn't, because for the first time, there was no excuse she could give. She shook her head, her face pale, her hands trembling, her voice barely above a whisper. No, she murmured, her eyes darting toward my father, looking for reassurance, looking for something, anything, that could prove me wrong. No, that's not possible. It is, I said, my voice calm, my words measured, my victory absolute. And deep down, you already know it. Silence. And then, finally, my father broke. He didn't scream. He didn't yell. He didn't demand proof. He just sat there, completely still, completely silent, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something I had never seen before, pure, absolute regret. Because he knew. Because after all these years, after everything, after choosing Jake over me time and time again, he finally realized he had chosen wrong. I could have stayed. I could have watched them unravel. Could have listened as my mother tried to justify the unjustifiable. Could have waited for my father to say something, anything, that would make this moment feel more satisfying than it already was. But I didn't need to, because I had won. So I stood, pushing my chair back, straightening my posture, glancing at them one last time, watching as they sat there, frozen in place, staring at the wreckage of their own making. And just before I walked out, just before I left them behind for good, just before I shut the door on this part of my life forever, I gave them one final gift. One last, devastating truth. You spent my whole life telling me Jake was better than me, I said, my voice steady, cool, calm, my heart not even racing anymore. But at least when things got hard, I didn't run, and with that I walked away. The walk to my car felt longer than it should have, the cool evening air wrapping around me, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing against my shoulders, heavier than I had expected. I had spent years waiting for this moment, waiting for the day my family would finally see Jake for who he really was, waiting for the moment they would be forced to acknowledge the truth they had spent a lifetime ignoring. And now that it had happened, now that I had laid it all out in front of them, now that I had delivered the final, devastating blow, I felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, no triumph, just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, a deep, bone-deep weariness that settled into my chest, making it hard to breathe, making it hard to think, making it impossible to feel anything other than empty. I had won, hadn't I? I had exposed Jake, had forced my parents to face the reality of their choices, had proven that I was never the failure they had believed me to be. I had taken back the power they had stolen from me years ago, had left them sitting in the ruins of their own blind devotion, had walked away without looking back. And yet, as I sat in my car, staring at my hands gripping the steering wheel, my fingers trembling slightly, my breath slow and steady but not quite right, I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it mattered. Because no one had won. Not me. Not them. Not even Jake. I drove without knowing where I was going, without thinking, without caring, the city lights blurring past my window, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the silence, my mind replaying everything on an endless loop. I had wanted justice, had wanted them to feel the same kind of helplessness I had felt for years, had wanted them to understand what it meant to be abandoned by the people you were supposed to be able to count on. And now they did. But justice wasn't supposed to feel like this. Justice wasn't supposed to feel so hollow. I pulled into an empty parking lot, resting my head against the back of the seat, staring up at the dark sky through the windshield, watching as the stars flickered dimly above me, distant and untouchable. I had spent my whole life trying to prove something to people who had never deserved my time, had spent years trying to make them see me, trying to make them care, trying to force them to acknowledge that I was worth something. But the truth was, it had never been about me. It had always been about them, about their expectations, about their disappointments, about their inability to see past their own selfishness. And for the first time, I understood I didn't need them to see me anymore. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their regret. I didn't need them at all. Somewhere in the distance, my phone buzzed, the sound pulling me out of my thoughts, the screen lighting up with a number I didn't recognize, a name I didn't expect, a message I hadn't been waiting for. But maybe, deep down, I had always known it was coming. Jake, we both know you went too far. You didn't have to do that. You think you won? You're just as bad as they are. I stared at the words for a long moment, my pulse slow, my chest still tight with something I couldn't quite name, my mind still too clouded to process what I was supposed to feel. Guilt? Satisfaction? Nothing at all? Maybe Jake was right. Maybe I'd gone too far. Maybe I had become something I never wanted to be. Or maybe this had been inevitable from the start. Maybe I just finally stopped pretending to be the person they had convinced themselves I was. I exhaled, deleting the message without responding, tossing my phone onto the passenger seat, pressing my hands against my face, letting the weight of it all settle in for just a moment longer before finally letting it go. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need answers. I didn't need closure. Because, in the end, there was nothing left to say. I reached for my phone again, my fingers hovering over the screen, my breath steady, my thoughts still tangled but no longer suffocating. And then, without another second of hesitation, I sent one final message. One last move. One last choice. One last piece of unfinished business. The screen went dark. The night stretched ahead of me. And as I pulled out of the parking lot, as I drove away from everything I had once thought I needed, as I left behind the wreckage of a family that had never really been mine, I didn't look back.